life. A complicated struggle of moral integrity. In it we find ourselves torn between two sides, one of light and one of dark. This battle only grows more apparent in Night Springs. We find this young man, a fallen warrior of light, ripped between these two sides. Darkness follows him like a curse as he walks this thin line in his own mind's eye. Finding solace in his own imagination, the man wanders onward, searching for himself and more.
Oh, God. You know, when I sat down and decided to try to come up with some sort of way to review this game, I sort of came up short in it because it's not a game. To me, it's not a game you just review because look, I'm going to give it to you straight. Alan Wake is my favorite game of all time, period. Just in general. And recently I finally decided, you know what, it does trump Sonic 3 and Knuckles for me. I love Sonic 3 and Knuckles. It's a great game. Second favorite. And it was my first favorite for a while, but you know what? I genuinely like Alan Wake more. And in order to explain why is not exactly the easiest of tasks. I can't just sum it up for you because, for me, Alan Wake, it means a lot more to me than to the regular gamer because the game was released during a time in my life when I needed some direction and I was going through a really hard time. And it sort of, I guess you could say it gave me hope. You know, I mean, I know that sounds kind of lame, you know, especially talking about a video game, but let's be realistic. I don't like to call myself a gamer because when you label yourself, you have to sort of abide by certain rules, and I don't really agree with that. But we're all of us, I assume all of us play video games, and I'm betting you that most of you have a game out there that speaks to you on a different level than everything else. It's not just a game to you. It's something else. It's something. It goes above and beyond what a simple game is, and it sort of hits you. It sort of strikes your soul rather than just your mind. It pulls on your heartstrings. It's you know what I mean? I mean, it's hard to explain. Maybe a lot of you know what I'm talking about by now. And for me, that game is Alan Wake. And I guess I should probably try to explain the actual game, you know, rather than tell you that I love it and that's it, because it deserves more than it's gotten, to be honest. And in a lot of ways, I find that Alan Wake is really, really underrated. The first problem, I think, is that this game was released at the same time as Red Dead Redemption, which was a horrible idea. Because, let's be realistic, you release a game at the same time as a big-budget Rockstar game, you're not going to win. You will lose. And you will lose badly, and that's I think is a big reason why Alan Wake undersold for the most part, because everyone wanted to play Red Dead. They'll chalk that up to another reason why I hate Red Dead. But, you know, it's more than that. I'm not sure whether people got, put off because it was a new IP, or whether they just didn't trust it. I don't know. I mean, it's from the same makers, original makers of Max Payne, which was a great game. You'd think they'd have a lot of support, but, it just didn't do as well as I think it deserves. And to be perfectly realistic, I find it a lot better than Max Payne in a lot of ways. Particularly from a narrative perspective, the story here, it's just so fucking good. It takes a lot of inspiration from, say, Stephen King.
He was dead.
And by a lot of, I mean, like, all the inspiration comes from Stephen King. And, I've heard complaints about that, but Stephen King is one of the greatest authors in recent history. I mean, he has so many published works. He's written so many great stories. I mean, yeah, occasionally Stephen King doesn't put out a good story, but no author does. But the man can write. He's a good writer. So someone explain to me why being inspired by someone like Stephen King is such a bad thing. There are worse choices. And the flow of the narrative is just perfect. It never really lags. It never really takes its time. The pacing is spot on here. The actual story, like I said, it speaks to me on a bit of a different level. I don't know whether you guys picked up on this, but I sort of have a thing for the struggle between light and darkness, That's sort of my thing. I don't know whether that was clear, just looking at me. And looking at what I've called myself all these years. But that's sort of something that resonates well with me, and the entire plot centers around this. You use light to force back the minions of the Dark Presence, as it's called. And obviously the lighting effects work really well. And it's not just run and gun, since the idea is that you have to eliminate the darkness protecting the enemies before you can actually kill them with your weapon. It leads to a different amount of strategy, and it's more about survival than anything, because you end up having to dodge attacks a lot, and it's just not one of those games where you can just blast through without much of a problem. You have to be really cautious. It does take some inspiration from survival horror games in that regard. I wouldn't call the game a survival horror game, and to be perfectly fair, I wouldn't call Alan Wake a horror game to begin with. It's more like a psychological thriller, which I suppose speaks well considering, again, based a lot on Stephen King's works, and that's really what Stephen King is best at, psychological thrillers. Tweaking your mind, making you think, things like that, and the whole story is about this. The atmosphere is fucking fantastic in this game. Everything feels appropriately bleak and spooky all the time, no matter what environment you're in. Oftentimes you're in the woods, but sometimes you're on a farm, or a small town, or a ghost town. It helps keep the game feeling fresh and new. Different weapons and pickups allow for different strategies. Using things like flashbang grenades, or larger flashlights that give out more light, or flare guns. Oh, holy crap, flare guns. Interacting with the world is actually fun. Cinematic events where you have to talk to people, or see different things in the town, and just try to get the sense of the environment. It helps get you immersed in the world. And it just occurred to me that while I've talked a lot about the story, I haven't really explained to you what the story is, so I should probably get around to doing that. The protagonist of the game is a writer by the name of Alan Wake, and he's come to Bright Falls, the name of the town, on vacation with his wife Alice. Long story short, Alice ends up getting kidnapped by the Dark Presence, and Alan is forced to write a story that, well, comes true. The idea is that Alan has specifically written the story so that the Dark Presence can't win, and he's written himself as the title character. And every single event in the game was written by Alan. I'd go into more detail about the supporting cast and, the story in general and where the plot takes you, but I really don't want to spoil much, to be perfectly realistic. There's so much about the game that you really just need to experience for yourself, and it'd be unfair of me to sit here and tell you it all, because it would ruin your reasons for playing it. And really, you need to play this game, if you haven't already. I guess I shouldn't say need, but I strongly recommend you do. It's seriously a great experience, and again, I know it probably resonates more deeply with me, but I can't help but feel like a lot of people, are selling themselves short by not at least giving this game a try. This is one of the few games where, I actually don't mind picking up collectibles. See, there's a bunch of different collectibles in the game, but the big ones are the pages, the manuscript pages from Alan's story. It is actually a lot of fun trying to track these things down and reading what's on them. It's that kind of game. And I suppose you're probably sitting there like, well, Darkness, does that mean the game is perfect? Alright, you're asking me to find a flaw in my favorite game of all time. For you guys, okay. Alright, one of the big flaws I think is that the spooky forest motif comes out a lot in this game. And early on, it happens more often than not, and it really feels like the story is just consistently trying to find an excuse to get Alan back in the woods. And I know he's in the mountains, and that's sort of a big part of the environment. And like I said, they do help spice it up with like ghost towns and levels that take place in actual Bright Falls and power plants. It's not like you're always in the woods, but you are there quite a bit, especially early in the game. And I'll admit, yeah, that can get a little old at times. Another complaint that really I don't really mind at all, and I don't really consider it a complaint, but it is a complaint I've heard, is that in order to get the real ending and continue the game, you will need to try out the DLC. And you know what, in Alan Wake's defense, a lot of games do this, but you might get so invested in the story that having to pay extra for the true ending, it might, you know, annoy you. And in fairness, the DLC for Alan Wake is great. It's lengthy, it's well worth the cost. I don't really consider it that big a deal, but yeah, I will admit that having to pay for the true ending, okay, that might piss a lot of people off, especially if you're the type of person who just outright hates DLC and prefers when developers include all the content in the game on the disc. I get that, but I don't really consider it a complaint here, but I will mention it as such, simply because I know a few people that might actually get annoyed by this. Enemy variety is also a bit of a problem. You do end up sort of shooting the same guys over and over and over and over again. They spice it up with large enemies or enemies that move really fast, but overall it can get a bit repetitive sometimes, especially on multiple playthroughs. But still, despite all those things, I love this game. Again, favorite game of all time, and just as a bonus, because it's Happy Halloween, and I love you guys have supported me for a long time, I'm not just going to review Alan Wake. Let's talk about Alan Wake American Nightmare. American Nightmare is a sort of sequel to Alan Wake. It is the sequel, but it's not Alan Wake 2. It's a DLC game available on Xbox Live, which of course I bought because I loved Alan Wake so much. And this follow-up to the game is also quite good. The gameplay is relatively similar, but they've added a lot of different things here. The writer of the game basically said that instead of channeling Stephen King, they channeled movies like Pulp Fiction for the style, which is why it's more of a gritty tone. And you know what, that's okay, nothing wrong with that. The story is actually centered around a time loop, and you're forced to combat Alan's evil doppelganger known as Mr. Scratch, who is probably one of the best villains I've ever seen in a video game. He really does come off as intimidating, and I think it's just his overwhelming aura of arrogance about him that you just can't not love. He's just so unbelievably evil, and you can tell he just does not care. And that's what makes him interesting.
I know. They all say that, right?
Alan is forced to consistently go back and try to rework things to fit with what he wrote. He has to make sure that everything falls in line, otherwise, well, the story he wrote won't come true, and Mr. Scratch will be allowed to continue his rampage of, well, killing. He's sort of a serial killer. By sort of, I mean he is. That's what he does. That's his thing. Yeah. And he taunts you through TVs. And you watch him, and then he kills someone, and it's like, oh, man, I wish I could stop that, but you can't. You can't, you just gotta keep going. The supporting cast isn't quite as compelling this time, but it's a DLC game, so I'm not really too surprised by that, and each character is interesting enough that, I really don't mind it. Plus, the story is mainly about Alan and Mr. Scratch and that struggle anyway, so that's not really too big of a deal.
It's time, buddy. You should just lie down and die. Let me take over. This is the only thing you've got coming to you. From here to eternity.
No matter how many times you come back.
In addition, the game is a lot more combat-focused this time around, and in order to compel that, they've added a lot of new weapons, different enemy types to spice things up, And overall, the combat is just a lot better in general, simply because of these changes. While is more combat, it doesn't really matter that much because you have more weapons to use, there's more enemy types to switch things up. It's a lot more interesting in that regard. The environments actually change too, which is nice, so there's a bit more variety, even though the game is a lot shorter than Alan Wake was. But, of course it's going to be shorter, it's a DLC game, what the hell do you expect? As a follow-up and sequel to Alan Wake, it's great. I don't consider it quite as good as the original, but it's also a lot shorter. And I also prefer the style of the original a little bit better. It was more atmospheric then. But here, everything's still okay, and you know what? At the end of the day, I just really hope that Alan Wake continues. I hope to see more of Alan Wake. Now, unfortunately, Remedy Games has basically said that they don't have any plans to continue Alan Wake right now for budgetary reasons and things like that. And now they're working on a new game for the Xbox One, which, in fairness, I am excited for that game because Remedy has wowed me already with Alan Wake. I hope to see more from them in terms of the games they make. But, I'd be a liar if I said I didn't want to see more of Alan Wake. These games are some of the best I've ever played. And, as I said, they mean a lot more to me personally than they might mean to most. But at the end of the day, they're great games, and I strongly recommend you give them a try if you haven't already. You're selling yourself short not to at least experience them once. Now, this is going to sound really confusing, but I actually have something I have to deal with. A little important. I'd explain more, but you wouldn't believe me even if I told you. So until next time, assuming there is next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.
You will never get them back.
Watch me.
And so this young man fights for those lost to him. If there is a light to be found at the end of the tunnel, he will certainly see it soon. In Night Springs.